Hello, hello, and welcome, guys. Thank you so much for coming. This is the World Anvil World Building Theme of the Month stream. So we go live every Sunday at this time. That is 2000 GMT, because we're in the UK and we do things in GMT. I know, right? So we go live every Sunday at this time with interviews and discussions and roundtables on our theme of the month. So this month, that's for the whole of February 2019, our theme of the month is World Scaffolding for World Building. So that's proper integration of natural and supernatural laws. And basically what we're trying to do here is we're trying to avoid world building plot holes. So I've just been informed that you guys can't see me, but hopefully you can still hear me. So I'm going to keep talking. Oh, you can see me. Oh, that's awesome. Well, hello, everybody. Okay. If you missed last week's stream, that was with Nate Smith from the World Building School. Then you can check that out on YouTube. And if you missed last month's streams about world building cultures and societies in your world, then you can check that out on YouTube as well. I think the links are going to go into the chat for that right now, by dint of magic and hand wavium, and also my lovely, lovely producer. So look at Trent standing there, sitting there so quietly, so beautifully. Nice. I'll get to you in a second, Trent. No problem. So sorry. We will be answering questions at the end of this. So absolutely put your questions in the chat so that we can see them and we will get to them. If you want to ask a question, ask capital letters question before your question, and then the producer will see it and they will get that question to me. All right, it is the moment. Trent, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. I'm very, very happy that the stream seems to be going well so far and that they can see me and things. So, you know, let's hope for the best.
Yep.
So our guest today is this lovely, lovely man, the amazing Dr. Trent Hergenrader from Rochester Institute of Technology, New York. Now, Trent is the assistant professor of the Department of English at Rochester Institute of Technology, USA. He teaches world building modules, and this semester he's using World Anvil to teach his class. So we are super excited about that.
I am too. Yeah.
Oh yes, it's so cool. He showed us that he'd put his whole semester plan and stuff for the module on World Anvil, and Dimitri and I had a massive geek out over it. We were so excited.
The small things that count, right?
Oh, it's so good. That was a win. That day we were like, yes, this is a win. So in addition to being a real professor of world building, real professor of world building people, Trent has also written fiction, which has appeared in such places as fantasy and science fiction, the Mammoth Book of Dieselpunk, and the best horror of the year, #1. He is co-editor of creative writing in the digital age, Bloomsbury 2015, and creative writing innovations. And his book, Collaborative World Building for Writers and Games, was published last year in October by Bloomsbury, and it is fantastic.
Thank you.
So Trent first came to us just sort of letting us know that he'd found World Anvil in the process of writing this book. And could we talk? And we were just so excited. So we've been chatting with Trent pretty much for a year now, or a little bit less.
Yep.
And it's just been awesome. So where are you right now, Trent? you're in the States, aren't you?
Yep, I'm in Rochester, New York, upstate New York. So it's a chilly 20 degrees with some wind chill, but it's nice, bright, sunny. So
I was going to ask, is it terribly snowy and cold there still?
We had both periods of real deep cold and then some good snow, but it's nice because I'm a northern boy, and I like my winter. So sometimes we kind of feel like we don't get enough of it. So then again, you hit like March and you're like, okay, I've had enough of it. When is spring going to get here? But that's all part of the game.
I like that so much. Okay, I am going to get down to some questions because I have a whole bunch of them for you. And remember, guys, if you have questions, throw them in the chat. But we are going to start about building worlds from the beginning. So the $1 million question, Trent, where do you start world building? How do you start world building?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think that's obviously what's sort of on everybody's mind when you begin a project. And I think, and I'll probably say this over the course of this entire conversation, I think really for me, world building is entirely dependent on the project that you sort of have as the end outcome? So are you doing world building just as like a fun project that is of its own, purpose, and you're just going to build a world for fun? Are you trying to write a novel? Are you trying to have a group of people who are going to be telling shared stories? That really kind of dictates, for me at least, and the way that I advise students, because I've been teaching different kinds of world building for probably about 7 or 8 years now. And really that comes to the forefront of how big does your world need to be? If you're writing a short story that's going to be 4,000 words, you don't need to write 700,000 words of a world, right? Like things can sort of be filled in as you go. But that's always one of the big considerations. And also, when do you start putting up limitations on how much you're going to create, right? So all these kind of questions. If you're going to write a novel and you're like J.R. Tolkien and you spend 40 years building your world before you actually get that book out, that's not maybe the most efficient use of a life.
World builder's disease.
Yeah, world builder's disease, right? So I think starting off and then thinking through, like, what is the end goal for this project? And then thinking as well, like, what is the genre? What is your audience? Who are you writing this for? Something as a writing instructor, writing professor, that's always one of the main things is if you're writing for yourself, then the answer really is who cares, right? You don't need to care about any of those things. But if you're assuming that you're going to have any other audience, you need to think about, well, what do they want? And we can see this a lot of times too, like when you're starting off with a genre. I've got one of my classes right now where it's like a high fantasy, steampunk, post-apocalyptic with aliens. And it's like, that may be like 2 or 3 genres too many. Like, can you find any examples of that kind of world, right? Because if the answer is no, there might be a reason why. And I think that's because they're doing the collaborative thing where there's 4 of them, and I think they each wanted to get their part in. But yeah, so I think overall, that's sort of where I would sort of start, is thinking about, what am I doing this for? What genre is it going to be in? How big does it need to be? And then going from there to see where it sort of goes next. What do you need? What's the thing that's absolutely essential? Another thing too that I would say that I'm in the mode of doing right now is sort of starting with randomly generating aspects of the world and seeing where that goes, and then figuring out who in this world would have the most interesting story. Because one of the things that I've seen over the years from working with lots of students is that the world is perfectly set up for this character, right? They are the perfect character, the
Right.
world is there, it's set up for them to be the hero, and go do whatever it is that they want to do. And I'm finding actually it's way more productive, especially for teaching beginning writers or student writers, to start with a world and asking questions. Well, who would have problems in this world? Who would have, issues that they would need to sort of overcome?
Right. Where is the conflict?
Yeah. Where do they sit within the society? All those kind of questions. And it gets away from that sort of, black cape wearing villain and the do-gooder hero and all those kind of things. When you think about just characters as being socially situated into a world that they were born into. None of us chose to be born into this world, at the time that we did. And that's the way we live our lives, is trying to figure out, well, what is it that we want to accomplish? Where do we fit within the social structures? What opportunities do we have? What obstacles do we have? And it's different for everybody. I think it's really helpful when you're storytelling to think about that from your character's perspective, right? Like, rather than saying, what does this character need? Create the world first, or at least some sort of structures of the world, and then figure out, well, what would be the most interesting characters? Like, what would be the most interesting perspectives for them to sort of, or the story to start with.
That's really cool. And I think actually you've unearthed a new, I'm not sure if it's a plot hole or if it's the opposite of a plot hole, whatever that would be in terms of world building. But things like main character plot armor, Mary Sueism,
Yep.
This feeling that the world has only been built for this main character in order for them to succeed,
Right.
is a major problem that actually does also feed into world building. So it's, again, I'm not sure if it's a world building plot hole or the antithesis of a world building plot hole, but it's something I had never considered as a world building problem until you just mentioned it now. That's really, really interesting as a new perspective.
Yeah, one of the things too that I've been sort of preaching to my students this particular semester is that your world shouldn't be built around a story, around a character story. It should be able to hold dozens, if not hundreds, of different perspectives and different stories. And if you don't think that your world can, satisfy that, then you're probably lacking some complexity. It's a little bit too collapsed and maybe a little bit too comfortable for that one character whose story you may be the most excited to tell. But then again, like, as you start to do some of the work of developing the world and thinking about the way the different aspects of the society work, you may even find that story changes. That story that you were so excited about, maybe the character is the same, but then you're like, well, wait a minute, they would have different problems, or they would start out in different places, or things like that. So I think being, especially for, world building projects tend to be large. So just sort of holding off maybe the storytelling, holding that off at arm's length until you get a little bit moving, right? And figuring out, well, what would be some of the more interesting ways that we could engage with this world? Because that also gets away, I think, from the info dump problem, which is another major world building issue. It's not so much an issue with the world building, it's with the storytelling, right? Like you start telling the story and you've done all this work and you just want to share that you've worked out the economic system. But if your character's not a banker, maybe they don't think about it all that much, right? They just go into a store and they pay for stuff. So I think that idea too, that your world needs to hold dozens of stories from dozens of different perspectives. And then you can return to it at any time, or you can, if you're writing a novel or something, you can write from different perspectives. We see this in, for example, George R. R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire, right? He's continually changing through those perspectives. So you're seeing the world through all these different lenses. The world is sort of the same, but the way that the characters move through it, act in it, the way that they see themselves in it, that changes from chapter to chapter. And I think that's a really healthy way to think about, rather than writing the objective truths of your world, you're writing something that most people would maybe generally agree with, that these things are generally true. But then when you start swapping through perspectives of the stories that you're telling, it can seem really, really different, right? I mean, based on whose story you're hearing it from. Is it a man? Is it a woman? Is it a child? Is it an adult? Is it somebody from the dominant race or from a minority race? Is it somebody who's really rich or really poor? Throughout the 5 books George R. R. Martin has published, I think he's got like 37 different perspectives. And that really allows him to look at the world from all of these different angles, and none of them need to be objectively true. They just all need to be subjectively true for the characters who are telling those stories.
Yeah. Okay. That's a really, really interesting perspective on world building. And again, I think having that sort of multiple POV really gives you so much color in your world.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked about how you start world building. And of course, you're a world building professor. So you see a lot of worlds growing up. You see a lot of worlds in their sort of finished state, whatever that means. What are danger points for world building plot holes? So what particular areas do you see new world builders struggling with?
Mm-hmm.
And what areas even do you see seasoned world builders struggling with?
Sure. Yeah, I think that right off the bat, like that idea of having the world that's tailored to a specific character, or a world that is going to support a very specific story that you want to tell. It's funny because I think everyone goes about it their own way. And I make points too, to say, like in the examples in the book, I talk about Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's work, because I'm a huge Tolkien fan. I teach a Tolkien class. I've taught a Star Wars class. I've taught a Game of Thrones class. So I mean, I'm really into all these kinds of stories. But none of the authors begin their work by using the system that I describe in collaborative world building. None of them had a tool like World Anvil when they were doing it, right? So everybody has sort of their own way. And I think maybe your own skills as a writer and some of the things that you do bad and some of the things that you need work on are probably unique to every world, right? Whoever is bringing their world building project up, they probably have certain strengths and weaknesses. But yeah, definitely that idea that you're going to make a world that's a little bit too tailored for one person. The other thing that I think, and this comes into, again, the book and the card building, the card deck system. I've got my card deck somewhere around here. These 14 categories that I have that describe the society. The problem is that people will focus on a specific aspect of the world and then just go totally deep without having done any of the work of breadth. And to give you one example, one of my first semesters when I was at RIT, I had a student who wasn't even one of my students. He just heard that I'd been hired, came up and said that he'd written this, 7 books, 800,000 words each, just like this crazy thing that he'd been working on since he was like 12 or 13. And it was all about this sort of like a Handmaid's Tale, this sort of religious theocratic force that was at play in the galaxy and doing all these things. And I remember I think I kind of destroyed him within like 3 questions. I was like, okay, that sounds cool. That's all good. But like, how do women work in this world? Like, are women part of this religion? Are they not part of this religion? And he hadn't thought about that. And I'm like, okay, well, what about race or species? And he hadn't really thought about that. I'm like, okay, what about class? Is like, can a pauper or a poor person get involved? And he hadn't thought about that. I'm like, okay, so go back to the beginning of those 800,000 words and start thinking through, right? How might all of these things come into play? And I think too, what you find when you have these large world building projects is maybe for that one beginning story, you don't need to have all of those answers. But as the character goes out or the characters go out and start to explore the wider world, maybe the military is super important in this corner of the world for whatever reason. And the corner of the world that you started in, it wasn't that way. So you didn't need to know that thing at that time. but it starts to feel, I think, more organic, and like all of the strands are connected. If you do that work to begin with, and say like, okay, globally we can say, or maybe, you know, at the size of this region, at the size of this nation, whatever size of the world it is that you're working on, generally that's how these things are working, or the tensions that are between all these different aspects of the society. But then when you zoom in this little place over here, that's like, it tends to be very heavily military and focused, and over here that's the religious hub, right? So then things will be different in that specific location. So I think thinking through that those broad concepts are really important, and even accounting for them. If they're not that important, if, you know, race issues isn't a big deal in your world, at least you've accounted for it, right? And at least you've thought about it. Again, I think another thing too to say is that what I really encourage students to use as a primary resource is Wikipedia, and look how Wikipedia can talk about major topics, because it's not objective. It's like dozens of subjective positions on like, how did World War I start? Well, most people would agree that these are the reasons that World War I started. However, there are some people who agree with this part and others don't, or people think this was super important and other people's don't. And I think that that's when you're building a fictional world, you also need to keep in mind that lots of different people are going to have lots of different opinions on how that world sort of quote unquote works. And you need to give time to them, even if they're minority, even if they're the tinfoil hat crazies, right? You need to have them that are working against sort of the dominant culture and the dominant ideology, rather than everybody sort of going lockstep in line, which I think is another problem. Like, for example, this theocratic galaxy that this student had created. It's like, well, that's just the way it works, and everybody goes along with it. It's like, well, no human society has ever worked that way. So it's going to seem false when people start engaging with it doesn't matter that it's sci-fi, it doesn't matter that it's deep space. People never get along that well. People never go in the same direction that well that we've ever seen in human history. So if your world works like that, because again, usually because it's convenient for your protagonist, that's something that needs to be addressed pretty early on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, the worlds that are too simplistic, worlds that are too homogenous, they just don't read as true. So yeah, totally. You know, I see that completely. There are a lot of people probably watching this who have not yet read your book. Absolutely, guys, you should check it out, Collaborative World Building.
They need to address that immediately.
Yes, we need to sort that out.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, can you talk us quickly through those categories that you were discussing? You sort of mentioned them on the fly.
Sure.
These are categories to look at when you start a new project.
Yeah, sure. So the book is broken up into a couple different sort of sections that describe the terminology that I use, and I apply the terminology to those worlds that I'd mentioned before, the Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire, the Lord of the Rings, all of Tolkien's work, The Hobbit, Silmarillion, Lord of the Rings, and then also Dungeons and Dragons, Star Wars. I do a little bit with Fallout. I'm a huge fan of the video game Fallout. But the idea is that, you know, you start off with thinking about, like I'd said earlier, the genre of the world and the audience of the world that you want to try and connect with when you're creating this world. And then there are three different aspects, which we've sort of been talking around a little bit already. It's the scope, the sequence, and the perspective of the world. And the scope is what's the physical size of the world. And then within the scope, there are focal points. So if we would look at something like Lord of the Rings, right? So we know that Middle Earth, the continent of Middle Earth, is sort of the larger scope of that world, even though we know that there's a bigger planet, there's a bigger galaxy. If you've read your Silmarillion, you know all that stuff. But realistically, the scope for Middle Earth or the scope for Lord of the Rings is just Middle Earth. But then there are things that I call focal points. So the Shire is a focal point, and Mordor is a focal point, and Gondor and Rivendell, right? So all those little places are little worlds within that larger world that operate by some of the same rules, but then they've got their own rules that they operate by. So we can see that when we look around a country, a big diverse country like the United States. The Northeast is different than the Southeast, right? And there are cities within those regions that are different. So thinking through that too, like what is the size you want to start with? How much detail do you need? The sequence is what has been happening in the world, and like, is your world at a moment of tension, which is usually a good place to start as well. And then finally, the perspective. Are you going to be telling this from sort of like the third person, omniscient, sort of like the Wikipedia, lots of subjective opinions? Is it going to be like literally a Bible that's been written by monks or something like that, right? There are those kinds of worlds too, where there's like a fictional layer about even doing the world building. So that's sort of the foundational work. I describe that as the foundational work. And then when you get into what I call structures and substructures, the four broad structures are governance, economics, social relations, and cultural influences. And within them, there are 14 other categories that are, I guess, can probably, if I could rattle through all these off the top of my head, you can tell I've been doing this a lot lately. For government, it's government presence, rule of law, so like the justice system, policing, things like that. Social services, which would be education, transportation. There they are. Yep. Those kinds of things. Economics is the wealth in the world, like the relative strength of the wealth in the world. Economic distribution, and then agriculture and trade. So just where's this wealth sort of coming from? For social relations, it is race, class, gender, and sexual orientation, and sort of the level of equality for each of those groups. And then finally, it's military, religion, technology, and arts and culture for the cultural influences, right? So what influences are at play in that world? So obviously, if you've got a religious theocracy that is running the government, then you're going to want to think about how those two things connect. But then the government and whatever cultural group is in power are going to have a lot to say about where the money goes. Where does the money come from? Where does it go? And then do we give it to everybody equally, or do we say those people don't get any, whoever those people may be, right? So it's all those kinds of questions of thinking through those 14 categories. And then each one, the way that you can either generate the world randomly. So I've got like, this is a number 4 card, right? So the scale from 1 to 5. Either you can shuffle the deck and deal it all out and then try and figure out what you've got there, which is usually what my students like doing too. They like to go full random. Or you can use it as a model. So like we read a bunch of short stories, we watched Fury Road, and then after each one I say, go use this 14 card system to model what you think that world is. And what happens is, and this is by design, nobody ever agrees, right? Nobody can ever agree what those categories mean, what the numbers mean, but it gives you some scaffolding to talk about those things, right? Well, if you think race relations are a 3, what would a 4 be? What would a 2 be, right? What do you mean by race relations in this world? Who's included in that? So it gives you tools, and I think part of the thing that I like too is that the game designers that I've worked with are like, it's too complicated, it's too much out on the table too early, right? I'm like, but that's kind of the way that I like it for a collaborative group, especially. You deal it all out, it's like super complicated, and you're like, whoa, I don't understand how any of this works. But then you start talking about it. You start talking through how you think these things would be connected. And I've been doing it for a while and it works. So students love it. It's a great place to start off for a creative project. And like I said, that's where I don't have as much time to do my fiction writing now as I did in years past. But that's where when I start thinking about what I want to write, I'm often tempted to just like, well, let's generate a random world, right? I mean, and then see where, I wouldn't come up with this myself, right? I need the fates to like help me generate a random world, and then start working through why there would be some weird things, like if class relations are really good, but the economic distribution is terrible. Well, what does that mean? Like, how would that work out? The class relations would be okay, but the actual wealth distribution would be bad. But then maybe class means something different. Maybe it's like a warrior class or a religious class or something.
So
like
it's more like castes than classes.
Yeah, right.
Or rather caste than classes.
Right, the caste system, right? Something like that. So again, that whole idea that rather than pre-planning, I want to tell a story in this world. It's like, well, let's generate a world first and then work through, like, this is weird. Like, I would never have come up with this myself. But if the fates are telling me this is the way the world works, let's start doing some mental gymnastics here and figure out how do these things all connect. So I think that that's really the thing, that going back to those pitfalls of you got to cover everything. You got to cover all 14, and yeah, it's complicated. And some of them you're going to be like, well, it doesn't, social services are just what you'd expect, right? I mean, they've got a government and they provide some level of social services. That's not the most interesting part. What's really interesting is this huge disparity between gender equality, right? Like, that's going to be central to my world. So just trying to use the system outlined in the book, either to use it as a semi-structure to get you started, or to do a complete random and you go from there, right? So if you're doing, like, for example, in the classes that I'm teaching, they're starting off with a post-apocalypse. So one of the things we talked about is, do we want to fix the values, right? Just put a number 1 down, meaning really, really low, for wealth distribution, because generally post-apocalypses tend to be really poor and they tend to be really stratified, right? One person, one warlord usually has all the goods. And they said, no, let's scramble it up and deal it out, right? Because what would it be like to have a post-apocalypse where there's lots of wealth? Like, what would that mean? What would that do? So then you don't run into, everything looking like the Road Warrior or Fury Road, right? I mean, like, you can get a different kind of world just by sort of divorcing your expectations for a genre, using this randomized deck.
Sure. And just by the way, guys, these cards that I was flashing up as Trent was talking in a very distracting manner, sorry, Trent,
That's fine.
these are cards which you can get from collaborativeworldbuilding.com. Is that correct, Trent? Yeah.
Yep, there's a free download, and then that one is a print on demand through the Game Crafter. So you can have a deck printed for you and shipped directly to you for like $25 or something.
Very cool. Otherwise, they are stunning cards. The artwork is beautiful, and we have the print on demand version. It's really nice. But again, if you don't have $25 to spare, you could just print it out from your computer and use it like that.
Yep.
And the idea of these is that you put them out and you put numbers next to them, and you can do it by random or you can do it by design, and you can choose how your world sort of hangs together. And my understanding, Trent, is that you don't need to go deeply into everything, like you said. Some things may just warrant a sentence or a small paragraph.
Yep, that's right. That's exactly right. So like what happens is the reason why I use numbered cards instead of using like a die, like rolling a 6-sided die or something, is you could roll 5 2s in a row, right? You know what I mean? And then it just doesn't seem to come together. Whereas the card, there are a couple low values, there's a couple high values, and generally between those, you're going to produce tensions, right? There's things in the world that are prevalent, and there are things in the world that are scarce, and it's very easy to start figuring out who would be affected by this, right? Who would be sort of caught in the crunch of this society with those values. So that's the idea. And then as you get the hang of it, I've got additional categories you can work in. I've got additional numbers that you can work in. So it starts to get a little bit more, you can get different results from it. But having done, I was playtesting it for like 3 or 4 years at conferences, at games and learning conferences and things like that. And the system with the 14 categories, there were like 16 categories, there were 10. This is where it sort of worked out sort of be the best balance. 14 categories and then cards 1 to 5. And there's also trending cards in there as well, a separate deck that you deal out trending cards. And I think it's 4 of the categories can either be trending up, meaning that they're going to be becoming more prevalent, or they're trending down, meaning that they're becoming less prevalent or more scarce. And again, that adds another wrinkle to start thinking through, why would the world work like this? What would be the forces at play? And then that's one of the things too, coming back to the idea of stories and characters in your world. Would the characters want to be preventing this from happening? Like if you're sliding towards a dictatorship, like no one in the UK or the United States may be experiencing right now, right? Like, are you going to be working against that? Or is it something that is like social progressivism that your character is going to be working toward, right? All those kinds of questions. Again, it's that idea of situating a character within that web of structures, social structures, and how is the world at that moment, in what I call in the book, in the point of the present, right? Maybe 20 years ago, it was different. Those values may have been different in some way. Maybe in 50 years in the future, they will be different again, right? You know, so just thinking through how those structures will change over time and change with the ways that the characters are going to be trying to move them, right? So if you think, just to use one example, Lord of the Rings, Sauron is coming in and trying to take over the world, so they want to prevent that. Star Wars, the Empire has taken over the world, and the rebels are trying to get rid of them, right? So I mean, very simplistic point of the present. That's where those stories start. That's what gets those characters moving. They're motivated by the events of the wider world and the way that they are situated in it.
Right. No, totally. Okay, so my next question was going to be, what methods or processes can you use to prevent world building plot holes? But I think you have just covered that.
Yep, pretty close.
Just before we go to a break, I want to ask you, how can you, if you're introducing non-Earth-like elements, like for example, magic or different natural laws like stronger gravity, or you've changed the way magnetism works, or ESP or whatever, how can you make sure that's integrated into your world in all ways?
Yeah, I think that's also where, I mean, this is one of the things that we talk about when we build fantasy worlds in these classes, in these world building classes, is to then sort of take those concepts or those extra extraordinary or extra real things that are part of your world, and then run it through systematically all 14 of those categories, right? So is magic like a currency? Is magic only available to one gender or one race or one sexual orientation or whatever it is, right? Is magic involved with religion? Or is it against religion? Is it against the military? Or like all those kind of questions. It could be really productive to move through, you know, so like thinking about economy or governance, right? Is magic somehow employed by whatever social structures the government has, right, to provide for people? Is it something that magic items are expensive, right? And it works that way. You know, one of the other things that I've got an extra card for is like the non-human. So that could be alien, that could be cyborg, AI. If you're in a fantasy world, it could be orcs or elves. And then just running through all of those questions again, right? I mean, like, are any of that, and then if you've got a fantasy world that has different species and magic, then you kind of have to start combining them and start thinking through, well, how do all these things connect and work together? And I think it's important to start doing that work with notes, with jotting things down, with little ideas, rather than committing to writing a ton at the beginning. Because this is something too that when I'm teaching writing, we tend to do a lot of scene-based stuff, vignette-based stuff, 1,000 words, 1,500 words. It's a lot easier to throw that away or just say, you know what, I'm going to revise this just a little bit, or it doesn't make enough sense, so I'm going to add to it. If you've got 5,000-6,000 words and you just realize you need to go back and touch that all, right? That's a lot more work. And 5 and 6, for a world building project, right? You're usually up in the 20 and 30,000 words before no time. So you really want to think these things through at a very deep level before you even really start committing stuff that you're sort of bent on keeping or you're excited about keeping. But yeah, and I think that's, the other thing too is the collaborative part. Even if you're building your world by yourself, it's really good to get that in front of different people who maybe have different life experiences. Because one of the things that, again, with the cards and then also the collaborative stuff, is that we're all limited by our own experiences and our own imaginations. You literally cannot imagine something that you can't imagine yourself, right? I mean, like, it's very hard to get out of that space. So then talking with people who maybe are from different parts of the world or different cultures, different socioeconomic classes, different races, different genders, right? To just give it a look and say, does this seem like it holds together for you in ways that are interesting? And again, doing that sort of early, even if you're not going to be building it with those people, at least just getting some feedback. Because again, you can go down that road of writing your $800,000 or 800,000 word space saga and then realize, oh no, I've made a terrible mistake and I didn't think about, how men and women or a third gender or a fourth gender aren't treated the same in this galaxy, right? It's like, okay, well, I guess back to the drawing board. And I think, like you'd mentioned earlier, for audiences, it doesn't take very long to find that, right? It's that blind spot for you is not going to be a blind spot for your audiences who will be able to pick up on it right away.
Yeah,
so I think that's one of it, is just always being sort of open and sharing it, even if you don't want to do the big reveal, right, and do it all in public, but just passing it around and saying, people, the other thing too is people who've read differently than you have, right? So if you've only, I have this case right now with a lot of students who have played really, the only thing they've read are like the media tie-ins for their favorite video games, right? So they're really, really narrowly focused. And then you can tell the ones who they've only read the Halo books and they're super into Halo and they know all the lore to Halo. It's like, okay, but that's this one property, right? And then people who are not that into it or, have broader interests can pick up on stuff that seems really convenient or flat and collapsed and convenient. So that's just another thing that I would always recommend is be open. I mean, this is true for writers all the time, is like, don't wait and write your novel up in your bedroom and not show it to anybody until you're done with it, because, it's better to get rolling feedback. I mean, this is what professional writers do all the time. They get feedback from people that they know, to start getting whether their ideas are good or bad before you commit all that time and effort into it.
Yeah, totally. All right. Well, we are going to cut for a short break now. When we come back, we are going to talk about retconning and fixing broken worlds. So how to diagnose if your world is broken, how to fix a world, and how to retcon something that's already been published. So big topics, very exciting. Remember, guys, if you have questions, make sure you get those in the chat and they will come to us. If we don't get to all of your questions today, I don't know how many have come in already, Dimitri and I in week 4, that is, I think, the 24th of February, will be going to be sitting down on the couch, that is over there, and doing a Q&A session with all the rest of your questions. So don't worry, they're not lost. We will still answer them. We're going to cut for this short break now. So grab yourself another drink and join us back soon. All right, guys, see you soon. Welcome back, guys. I hope you've refreshed your drinks. I have a new cup of tea that is the size of my face, so I should be good for the next 20 minutes at least. All right. When we left, we were talking about how to integrate natural and supernatural laws into your world, how to make sure that your magic or your secondary sapient species were properly integrated. Now we're going to talk about retconning, that is to say, retroactively contriving after you've already published or after something is already done, or fixing broken things while they're still on the drawing board. So that is our topic for the second half. So the $1 million question, how can you diagnose world-building plot holes or inconsistencies in your own work?
Yeah, how do you do that, right? That's one big question. I think having it in front of an audience is probably one big way, right? Where before you go pro, right? If you're going to show it to people and see if they can detect things as early as possible. But I think one of the other fun things is that we have these retcon, I don't know whether they're masters or not, but they certainly are experienced, and that is J.R. Tolkien and the entire Star Wars, the entire Star Wars galaxy, which is sort of an interesting thing now that Disney, I don't know if you're not familiar with it, Disney bought the property from George Lucas and said all the old EU, the extended universe stuff, they shelved it. They didn't delete it, they shelved it. Now they're selectively bringing it back in, right? And a lot of that is because they're retconning, right? There are things that just don't seem to make sense. But when Lucas sold the rights over, he said, okay, well, the 6 films at that time, including the prequels, which introduced so many inconsistencies and so many problems, that's part of the furniture, right? You cannot have the property without having that stuff. Tolkien is, and I'll get to how I think you fix it in just a second. Tolkien was the same way. So when if you're not familiar with that history, he'd been working on his languages and his world forever, right? Since he was a boy, practically. And then he wrote The Hobbit and had not thought about consistency and coherence and all of these things, and introduced all sorts of stuff in The Hobbit that was not consistent with what he was, it was sort of like in his mind is the objective truth about his world. So I think the big answer to the big question of how do you find them, I think, is showing it to other people. I don't know if there's any other way to get to those things that you don't see because you don't see them, right? So you need to have somebody else sort of point them out. I suppose you could stumble across one down the road if you just think that doesn't make any sense. But the other thing is that what Tolkien specifically did, and it's sort of clever, it's cheating, but it's sort of clever, is he just went straight to perspective, right? Where it's like, well, this wasn't the objective story. This was one person's version of the story.
Unreliable narrator.
Yeah, right. So then that's where too, like if you're not familiar with the Silmarillion or the wider mythology of Middle Earth, that basically all The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and the Silmarillion are all supposed to be penned by Bilbo and Frodo in a very removed, sort of distant. They don't use the first person; they use the third person. And that was one of the things that he was saying with the inaccuracies between different versions of The Hobbit. Two different editions of The Hobbit had different inaccuracies there as well. And then like the Silmarillion, that's not really the story of the elves. That's the story of the elves understood by Bilbo during his time in Rivendell from asking questions, right? So he really just sort of fudges the whole thing. And you kind of got to pay attention closely to where he mentions this. But I think that that's one of the things, too, that I would say same thing is happening in Star Wars, right? Where these are perspectives. These are not objective truths. These are perspectives on events. And they're, depending on the kind of errors that you've made or the things that you need to retcon, that's one thing to throw in there right away, is to be able to say, oh, well, people thought this, or, this was just one person's perspective of the person who wrote it down. And you could think through too about something like from Newton to Einstein, right? Like, well, when Einstein's physics basically replaced Newton's and say he was more or less, what he said was more or less correct in a sense, but now we know all this other stuff, right? So I think that there's that perspective as well that you could bring in, that this was the old way of thinking, and now we realize there is this new way, right? Something that supersedes what I had written originally, this new information now complicates it, puts it into play, right? Those kinds of questions. And if you've got specific examples, there's so many ways that you can make mistakes in world building, and so many ways that you can try and patch them up and correct them. But I think, the way that Disney is largely doing it is by telling new stories, right? Like telling new stories that bring new information that will bridge that apparent inconsistency to make sense of it. That's what Rogue One has been called, like the biggest retcon of all time, right? Like how did that happen? How is it that, they would not have figured out that there was this problem with the Death Star? And it's like, oh, well, because they spoiler, they intended to put it there, right? The scientist who was working on the Death Star did it deliberately. So I think that there's, different types of ways that you make mistakes, or different types of incoherencies, and then different ways that you can then try and approach them. But I do think that just different perspectives and new stories is one way to try and plug those gaps.
Yeah, really cool. And again, as Rogue One did, shifting in time.
Yep.
To give believability to all of that new information and all of that new new science and new thinking, or however you want to do it. Like a time shift will give you a little bit more believability in the eyes of your audience, maybe.
Yep. Absolutely. And that's where too, like in the book, when I'm talking about the timeline, and this is under the sequence header, under the timeline, you got your point of the present. Well, if you want to do sequels, you just kick that point of the present out further into the future. If you want to do prequels, you just move back further on the timeline, right? So it should always be that your world is fixed at that point and things were different, however long ago. Things will be different in the future. It's just that your characters are now in this moment telling their stories, and you need to understand something about the history and also where the world seems to be going down the road too, is another interesting way to position it. So that could be another way to retcon as well, is like, it doesn't seem to make much sense and no one knows why, but we're going to be trying to change that in the future. Could possibly be another technique.
Sure. So basically hanging a lantern on it, hanging
Yep.
the in-world characters observing this thing does not make sense.
Yep. Right.
Wow, that's really cool.
The official record, the official record of what we understood or what we were taught in school or however you receive that cultural information does not seem to be working, right? I mean, and this is one of the things too that I think it's not so much a retcon, but I've taught the novel Game of Thrones before, and it's really, after you read it a couple times and you talk about it, it's really about Ned Stark just not understanding the world that he's going into. It's not that he's morally correct. It's that he is completely out of his element, and the rules of the world that he's playing by, the rules of the North, do not apply at all, and he just cannot figure that out, right? And again, I won't spoil the ending of Game of Thrones, but yeah, things happen.
I think that's gone past the International Institute of Spoilers.
Exactly.
At this point. It's been out a while.
I got yelled at a conference like 5 years ago for spoiling it. And I was like, give me a break. Like, if you don't know it, you deserve to have it spoiled. So.
Right. It was published quite a long time ago at this point. The book, at least. I mean,
probably 20 years, if not more.
Right. Okay. Exactly. No, I think we can put pay to any notion of spoiler shame in that.
Yeah, the train has left the station on that one. So.
Right. Exactly. So how important is it to fix a world building plot hole, do you think?
I guess it's the question too is how, all these questions are always answered by it depends, right? I mean, and it's a question. Right. It's a question of what was the nature of it. If it creates total incoherence, then you need to do it immediately, right, and figure it out. But if it's these small things, like one of the things, to give a specific example from The Hobbit, one of the things that, if you remember, the trolls capture them early on, and then they're doing the riddle thing where they keep them up until the sun rises and they turn to stone. Yeah. And there's one moment in there where one of the trolls says, pity the poor blighter or something like that. And Tolkien's problem was that a troll would never be able to know what pity is or show pity to anybody, right? So this is where he goes back and says, well, the troll actually didn't say that. That was Bilbo misremembering what the troll had said because the troll never would have said it, right? So that's sort of, and how many people are even going to notice that? It probably bugged him more than it bugged anybody else. But that's a really small way of using that perspective thing to fix it. But if you've got something like you've never thought about, and this happens a lot with young men, I've noticed, they've never thought about how women experience the world, right? That is a much bigger problem. And, to go back and just do that work of like thinking through these major issues. And it could be that you didn't realize it before, but it's a heavily patriarchal world, right? And women are supposed to be kept away from all sorts of public functions. That could be one way to sort of correct that major oversight. And again, it may give you a much more interesting perspective on where to tell stories from, right? I would think in that heavily patriarchal world, maybe a woman's story would be the most interesting one of all, right? So, but it's really contextual. It depends on the project. It depends on the mistake. And it depends on maybe the different options you have for fixing it. But like all writing advice, right? All writing advice is always contextual, which is why there are billions of books on the shelves about how to publish your work. And we don't all buy those and then get all of our work published, right? I mean, it's because it's like, well, that project that you're working on, there is no one solution. There's probably a bunch, but unless that writer is sitting right on top of you telling you which one it is, right? That's why people take writing classes and do writing workshops and writing groups.
Yeah, absolutely. So if my world is broken, if I have forgotten something, like I have magic, but I've forgotten how that would influence classes, how do I deal with that? How do I go back and unpick that? If I've got like half a novel written, for example.
Right, right. And I think that that's where, so if you've got a novel where you've never thought about the issue, just to use your example of magic in class, then I would start thinking through quickly where, so if you're halfway through your novel and you've got this issue where you think, wow, class is going to matter, um, I would imagine in that scenario, it wouldn't matter that much to your character. So your character would not have noticed it at all. So then thinking about ways in which other characters or other perspectives, or maybe an event in the last third of the novel would bring that to that person's attention. Because I mean, this is also what we do at university, right? Is that you get students who are coming from different walks of life and they come together and we talk about how the different ways that people experience the world. And if you grew up like in the United States, if you grew up as an affluent young white man in the suburbs, you may have a completely different experience from somebody who lived in the heart of New York City in a not a great neighborhood, right? Those kinds of things. And you put people in conversation to begin to talk about those things. And the reason why, it's not that the person who grew up in the suburbs was evil or wrong or bad. They just had limited experience. And I think that that is another way, especially if your world is already being shown through a narrative, then just go back to that perspective thing. Why is it that your character was unaware of this? And then use some sort of plot twist or some plot device to introduce somebody who is from a very different class, right? A very rich person who's never heard of magic, because magic is for the paupers or whatever. You don't need magic if you use technology or something along those lines. Might be one way to address it. The other thing too is that good world building in these masterful long works or large works with these sprawling worlds, it's always dribbled in, right? It's always very small things. So it doesn't mean that you necessarily would need to go back and change every single chapter, but you might look from scene to scene and say, is there a way in these scenes or in these moments in the novel in which I could introduce one moment that would sort of cast a light on it, right? Even if the main character doesn't fully get it, your reader might. So I think that there's lots of different ways, and it's really hard to have like a completely broken world that is unfixable. I think the bigger thing is noticing it before you get too far down the road, right? And then thinking about what are all the clever ways that I might be able to address this blind spot.
And that's where beta readers and world building chat and writing groups and all of that stuff comes in.
Yep, absolutely. And that's where too, like the things that I run into, we're going to have in the world building class that I'm teaching this semester, they have to give presentations. So the group of 4 students have to get up and talk about their world for 5 or 10 minutes or something like that. And the rest of us are going to be sitting back as critically thinking audience members and being like, well, wait a minute. Like if that were the case, if they're living in a lava tube, where are they getting their food from? Right. I mean, like, how does that work? Because maybe they haven't thought that through. And that's my job too, is to be as the professor, is to wander around the room and ask them really pointed, annoying questions. And it's not that, if you haven't thought about it, you're a failure. If you haven't thought about it, now you have to think about it. Now you have to address it. And if there are things that are just, this is, the thing with Star Wars too, is that some of those things from the prequels that were introduced are just so dumb that you can't get around them, right? I mean, and then it's just like, well, I guess that's part of it. But there are plenty of worlds that have gaping holes, I think, that if you look at Song of Ice and Fire as well, like nothing, I've had people, or read things rather, where people looked at the economy, they looked at the distances, like how big would the wall need to be, how long did it take to get from King's Landing from the north to King's Landing, from the north to King's Landing. And like, if you start mapping all that out, the world is completely distorted, doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It hasn't stopped him from becoming a global phenomenon, you know what I mean, and world famous. So you also have to wonder too, if it matters, if the stories are good enough, and the mistakes aren't that egregious. Maybe it's not that big of a deal in the world.
Sure, you can spot mistakes and still love a franchise.
Yep, sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I would love to ask you questions forever, but unfortunately I can't do that because that would be selfish, and I have to ask some audience questions now.
Sure, so I'm happy to come back whenever too. If the conversation's good and we want to do this again, I'm happy to do that too.
Well, that's exciting. That would be wonderful. Yes, we would love to have you back. We have coming up this year, we're going to have a discussion about integrating magic and technology and the relationship between the two in world building. Cool. So absolutely, we would love to get you on for that. That will be the porcelain argument topic of the month, which will be coming later this year. Yep. In the meantime, we have a question from TJ. I'd love to build a collaborative world with my fellow chapter members on the World Anvil Discord. And I wanted to know if, along the way with the amazing advice from your book, you have any extra tips that you've learned along the way of teaching and working with the book that will make team collaboration projects work even better.
Yeah, I think there's a whole section that I just went through because we're moving in my class. We're moving to the collaborative part where we did some reading and did some sort of theoretical stuff. And I think one of the things that encapsulates a lot of working in a group is sort of the improv. If people have done improv comedy, the yes and approach, where if somebody comes up with an idea, because people get really hot about their world building ideas and can argue quite forcefully for their ideas. And I think there's actually lots of ways to be able to say, well, yes, and right, like we can have that, but what we're going to do is add some different angle to it. Another thing too, I mean, this kind of comes from the world of literary theory or postmodern sort of theory, is for everything that exists, there's got to be some sort of opposition to it, some sort of direct opposite. And to keep thinking through, if you've got some sort of feature of the world, think about what would be the direct opposite of that, that is going to create tension, that is going to create all these third and fourth different options that may be around it. And that's a way for everybody to get a little bit of their own ideas in it. I think one of the things that I really like about doing collaborative world building projects is that you all need to agree more or less about how the world is working in a general sense, right? You know, for this, however big the world is, or however the scope is, you all have to agree how the world is generally working. But then you can zoom in and you're like, I'm just going to create this little super religious town, right? You know what I mean? And then it's like, that's just going to be me. I'm just going to work on that. If you want to come in, I'm going to play by my own rules and I'm going to explain how that works. But it's a way of giving everybody that group work feel and like banging ideas off each other and getting the best out of everyone. But then you also have those opportunities to just do that one specific thing that you want to do that you think is cool. And that's where, you know, the collaborative part becomes, the world becomes weirder. It becomes, you know, there are more things that don't seem to make sense. But I mean, like in our world, we've got the platypus, right? Like, no, you know, where did the platypus come from? And it's like, you never think that that would exist. We have all sorts of weird political situations or societies or groups, you know, or, you know, all sorts of things that you wouldn't naturally think would exist, but they do, right? The whole truth is stranger than fiction sometimes. And I think that you get closer to that when you've got lots of people bringing lots of their own ideas to it. But yeah, that sort of yes and approach, that it doesn't, you don't need to die on every hill, right? You know, it's got to be your way or the highway. And a lot of times too, as I preach to my students, it's actually more fun to not go with your idea and then maybe be subversive or be the one who is working against some other idea that's in the world. So if you all agree that, you know, the world works in this way, it's okay, it works in that way, but there's got to be people who don't want it to work that way, regardless of what it is. So work in that space, right? Create those characters, create those, you know, secret societies or whatever. And the only other thing I would say is in that time frame of like, if everyone's working on a collaborative world, don't keep secrets. Don't try and spring something on somebody 2 months down the road, because it never works out well. It works out okay if you're doing a role-playing game where the GM is going to have some information that they don't want to share with the rest of the group. But otherwise, just be open with it. So it's like, if there's this weird secret society, share that. So then your other collaborators can then create a member in it, you know what I mean? Or create the detective who's trying to hunt that secret society down or whatever. It's just way better if all cards are sort of, you know, figuratively and literally out on the table while you're working on it, unless you're doing something like a role-playing game in which it's more fun to then say there's a castle on the hill and no one knows, you know, what's there except for the GM. The GM knows exactly what's there. It's more fun for the players not to know. And of course,
Right.
all those tools are built into World Anvil, aren't they?
Yes, they are. But and again, in that kind of setup, you have more of a hierarchy, or you have different roles. But I think yeah, being aware of those different roles within the group. So if you're a DM versus players, if you're all equals or whatever,
Yep.
yeah. What are your personal favorite aspects or types of world building? This is a question from Morio Streams.
Okay, so what my favorite aspects of world building, or like world building projects, I think are the unexpected things that come up. And I would say that this tends to happen. So for the last however many years, eight or so years when I've been teaching these classes, I usually will either have some concept. So one thing that I've been doing in certain types of classes that I do, either we will obliterate our city and create a post-apocalypse, or we try and engage with local history and local sort of locations and things like that, cultural places, in which we do like a steampunk. So we've done steampunk Rochester. I brought 5 students to Porto 2 summers ago, and they created a sort of there was this rupture in the world, like in the 15th century. So they took the history of Porto of the 15th century and then created this weird magic, you know, whatever. So, I'll often start off with some overarching, genre or concept, but then from there, letting it go and seeing what weird things other people come up with. And especially, it's like if two ideas are coming together and you use that yes and approach, then weird stuff pops out that you would not have come up with on your own, working on your own up in your office, right? And it's really necessary to have those different ideas coming out. But then, if you like working on projects by yourself, I think using lots of role-playing game tools like random encounters, like doing lots of things with dice and cards, just to make yourself working against something so you don't have it your own way. And then the cool stuff that pops out of it. And I mean, this is where too, it could be a person, it could be a location, it could be a historical event, right? Like, well, why would this thing happen? And it's like, I know, because there was this group of teenage girls who pretended to be witches. You know what I mean? Like that happened 10 years ago, and that's how we got here, right? Those just sort of crazy things that your imagination fires off to help make the world seem more full or plug holes. That's always my favorite part. And that's where too, like I'm sure many people who are on World Anvil and many world builders feel this way. It's almost more fun to just to do the world building than to ever get to a story, because the more you go in, the more details that you have. And this is one of the things towards the end of the book too that I talk about, this lure of endless world building, is every character will have parents, every character will have siblings, or most characters will have siblings, and those characters will have problems, and they will have gone to places that the other characters don't, right? So it can just kind of keep spawning out. But then again, that comes back to those questions of telling stories perspective, telling stories about the sequence. Well, what was this character's parents doing 50 years ago, right? Or what would they do in 10 years, or things like that. So it's all just sort of good. And I think it's the unexpected stuff rather than I have this pristine world that I'm going to execute to perfection. Messy, weird, things that you don't expect. I think those are my favorite parts of my own world building projects. And then it's super fun to also help other people with theirs, right? To just oversee it and to not have the creative input, but just sort of like the complicating input, and then seeing how they come up with really cool stuff when you ask them difficult questions.
I love that. Poke it and see what they do.
Yeah, exactly.
We have a very specific question here from Dr. Steve. What advice would you give to K-12 and higher educators seeking to adopt world building as a pedagogical tool for teaching math, world language, science, English, history, etc. content? For instance, either having students develop worlds or using a world you've developed to tell transmedia stories about math, science, etc.
Yeah, right. So I think that when we start thinking about stories and you're thinking about perspective from different characters, right? This is this whole question of what is the perspective of the story that you're telling, and what is the world in which this person finds themselves. So I think for people who do games in education or game-based learning, simulations and role play tend to be, I think, consistently the best ways to get people to understand how these systems work. And world building projects are really just systems, right? I mean, it's a project in which you're trying to figure out how are all the different social systems working at any given moment. One of the things that's been a little bit of a hang up for me in K through 12, like trying to push this at the K through 12 level, is I'm not sure cognitively what a fourth grader, I guess I have a fourth grader, but like how much he could cognitively take on, because it's really complicated, right? The world's really, really complicated. And we know that history tends to be simplified when we're telling our national stories, for kids who are growing up. And this is one of the questions that I just want to work with people who are doing or education PhDs, ed psych, those kind of things. Figure out how could you simplify the system to the point at which kids could connect with it without oversimplifying and being like the world is a structured, simplified place, right? This is a question that I don't really have the answer to. But there are role-playing games that are situated within very specific historical moments. There's also a group of products called Reacting to the Past for historians that ask people, for example, to be in a Roman forum, and every student plays the role of a different person in the Roman forum, and they need to try and persuade each other. And I think these are all small steps towards doing these same kind of questions, where a world building project would be, well, let's rebuild an ancient Aztec city based on, we're going to read these texts, we're going to deconstruct how we think that world worked, we're going to talk about what it meant to be on the top of that social hierarchy, what it meant to be on the low end, what it would mean to live in the mountains of an Aztec kingdom versus on the coast. And then try and say, well, what kind of stories would be available to what kind of characters, right? How would they be able to make these discoveries about the world? And you could do the same thing through a history of science, right? Like where I'm fairly familiar with sort of the era of Charles Darwin and how when he was developing his theory of evolution, right? So you could ask, well, and he's a really interesting case too because of his religious background, right? So then you could start to say, well, what, in that time in the late 19th century, what was the world like, right? What was the world of Great Britain like, and where did Charles Darwin find himself? And what kind of mode of thought did he need to be in, or Einstein for that matter too? What kind of mode of thought did he need to be in that society to be able to start working on these kinds of ideas? And I think the reason why it's really powerful is because it makes sense when you start thinking about all of us in our own lives are the PCs in our own role-playing game, right? Like we all have to make choices. We all are locked into the world. We can't time travel yet. So we're all born into this world, right? We're all living in the 21st century, and we have to think very critically about what are the cultures that we're from, right? So I was, I'm a 21st century person living in the United States. So what do I take for granted? What do I think the world works like? Where if I go to Rio, maybe somebody doesn't believe the same things. Or if I go to Jakarta, right, maybe the worldview is different. And who's to say who's right or wrong, right? So I think all of these things translate pretty easily. And I think especially when you get into high school and definitely college, people pick it up like that. How younger you could go, I think is a good question. But thinking about how history comes about through very specific decisions that individual people made, right, is a really important concept. And I don't know how early on you could go, but I would think pretty early with that, right? The reason why we're here is because a certain group of people made very specific decisions, and then these things happened, right? So this working with historians, I know this is one of the things that they always want to get away from, is this idea that history happened and we just have to learn what happened because that's the way it happened. It's like, well, history is really about debating what things could have happened or why they happened that way, and all sorts of other kinds of questions. And again, it's just super complicated. It's super complex. But I think you also get to see that you are an actor who can make choices and make the world different, because that's where everybody who came before you was in that same sort of situation with certain advantages or disadvantages. And I think it's really empowering to teach students that they are just one of those people who can make changes in the world themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting as well because I've been working on a university level, on a high level, looking at using World Anvil to do archaeological reconstructions. Mm-hmm. And basically then to present those archaeological reconstructions to the public in a way that the public can understand and have the data in a way that is sort of comprehensible easily. Not saying the public are idiots or anything, but they're not trained archaeologists and presenting that data. But again, as you mentioned, doing things like if your kids are studying the Romans, which I know I did in school when I was sort of 7, making a historical model of the Romans and then going into the language template on World Anvil and being like, well, these are a few Roman words that were very important in the Roman world. This is how the number system worked. So that would also be, for example, a language, and this is how it sort of worked together. This is what the history looked like. This is a cultural tradition, and again, even on a fairly straightforward level, building up these kind of historical models would be very, very easy to do that in a transmedia way, in a trans subject way.
Yep, absolutely. And then that idea too of importing the role playing then, in which, because one of the things that I've done in my classes before too, so like in these post-apocalyptic worlds, we'll talk about how the resources are distributed. And usually they say, okay, well, 10% of the people have 90% of the stuff. So then what we'll do if I've got 20 students is I'll deal out like physical cards where it's like, okay, you're poor, you're poor, you're poor, you're poor, you're poor, right? And then like you get the one student who is the rich character, right? And all of a sudden they have a target on their back and they didn't ask for it. It's like totally random. And it's like, okay, but in this world, if you have the stuff, people are coming for the stuff, right? So I mean, like if you're the character in that world, you're going to have to make sure that you defend yourself. And it's no longer like you're the greedy, evil person who's hoarding all this stuff. It's you're that person and you want to hang on to it, right?
Right, so, exactly. Yeah. And suddenly the motivations just become very human and very understand.
Yeah, it becomes very situated in that culture, in that moment, and then also with the personality of that character.
Yeah, totally. Well, I would happily talk to you all day, but I do have to wrap up. I have one final question from Dr. Steve. What kinds of world building or storytelling research are you working on now?
Yeah, so right now, what I'm working on is working on lots of different things simultaneously, as always.
I know the feeling.
Yeah, one of the things that I am working on is trying to figure out other ways that I can bring just like you're saying, you're bringing World Anvil to an archaeology, the field of archaeology, to be able to explain trying to figure out other ways that I can cross. So one of the limitations is that the publisher is really interested in bringing the book to creative writing classrooms. I'm interested in game design. I'm interested in people who are just playing role-playing games, or they've got a local book group. So that work is all on me. They really only have the marketing budget to pitch it to academics who are going to be trying to bring the book to classrooms, which is great. But I think it can reach a lot more people. So that's one big thing, is trying to figure out. And then also, how can I work with historians? How can I work with people who teach literature? How can I, people who teach policy? How might this work be able to interface with that? And then on the other side, there's also this large scale sort of transmedia story world concept, where we have in this 21st century, on your iPad, you've got your comics and you've got your TV shows and your movies. And increasingly we see things like the Marvel universe and Star Wars that are expanding out. And I mean, in a very sort of pessimistic way or a cynical way, it's so they can make money, right? They can tap into lots of different audiences across lots of different media and get more money. But there is this idea of trying to keep the story balanced and making sense across these large scale worlds. So that's one of the things that I've got a project working on, to sort of analyze Star Wars and how Star Wars is Galaxy's Edge specifically. How people are going to be, role playing. They're going to be going in and physically, if you're not familiar with it, Galaxy's Edge is being added to both Disney World and Disneyland as a hotel that's set in the Star Wars universe.
Okay.
And when you come in as a customer, as a park visitor, you get to have a character that you are embodying, right? And there's all sorts of interesting questions about how much do you know about that massive world? How much does that affect what you do in the park, or how you act in the park as a physically embodied person, right? This goes back to what we were just talking about with role play and thinking about social situations. Well, Star Wars isn't a historical time period. It is a fictional time period that people are going to be involved with, or role playing through, or participating with. And I think these are questions that first time in human history, this stuff has been happening, right? I mean, like that we have a theme park that's inviting people to come in and role play in this massive transmedia story world. Right. So it does tie into like, how do we build worlds? How do we understand worlds? How do we interact with them, participate, what stories come out of them? And that's always where I'm really interested, is just the storytelling aspect. How do we make stories that mean something to us and to others? And a big part of that now sort of is world building. So all of that is sort of rolling around, and like any good academic, it matters if I get grant money, those kind of things, to see what people are interested in. But those are some of the things that I'm interested in. Another thing too is I'd love to be able to try and get a grant. I don't do nearly as much fiction writing as I used to, but still have lots of connections with major publications, and sort of heavy hitters in that world, and see if I could get enough money to entice people to make a world together and then tell a bunch of stories. If George R.R. Martin did this with the Wild Card series. Before this, there was Thieves World, which was like in the late 70s, early 80s, a bunch of people who were basically doing this with D&D, right? Where a bunch of authors who came together, built their own world, and then could tell stories with each other's characters in it. So I think as tools like World Anvil become more prevalent, more popular, it would be really fun to be able to say, okay, we're going to just do this project for a month. I'll give you each $2,000 or whatever, right? And you got to write X number of words. And let's just have some heavy hitters, in the science fiction and fantasy world, do this project together. And of course, everyone needs to put food on the table, so they won't do it without the money. And I don't have the money unless I get a grant. But that's another thing that's sort of in the back of my head to work on in the future.
Such a cool project. Okay, well, I'm afraid we do have to draw to a close now. Trent, thank you very much for joining us today.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the World Anvil community as well. I pop in every once in a while on the Discord, so I'm happy to answer more questions. If you buy the book, let me know what you think. There's a contact form on the website as well, collaborativeworldbuilding.com, if you want to try and reach out. I am available. I'm going to be, a couple people have invited me to give talks at local libraries, things like that. So that's great. I'd be happy to stay in touch with everybody.
Absolutely awesome. And again, Trent is going to come on later in the year again. He has given me his word on...
You're actually obligated now, right?
Right, exactly. He's given me his word on stream, on camera, so he can't back out of it now.
Right.
You've been such a good sport today. And I know that our producer is dropping those links in the chat right now, guys. So if you haven't checked out Trent's book, you absolutely really must do that. I cannot recommend it enough. It is a fantastic book. That said, I have some more thank yous to give. I have to thank all of you guys. Thank you so much for coming to join us. Thank you so much for listening today. And thank you for all of your questions. Remember, if you asked a question today and it was not addressed, we will be answering all the rest of the questions on our Twitch stream, a Q&A Twitch stream with me and Dimitri on the 24th of February. That's the fourth Sunday in February. So stay tuned and tune in for that. This episode will be available on our YouTube channel next week. So that's youtube.com/World Anvil. So if you want to check it out again, if you want to have any extra information or some links in the description, you should go check that out. And if you haven't seen last month's streams, you should go check those out as well. That is all about world building cultures and societies. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe for more world building content. I think that's about all from us. So, guys, I would like to ask you to grab your hammer and go world build.